Our next speaker is Mahmoud, Jalloh.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you to the organizers. This has been really fun. And also, apologies, my body has been disagreeing with me, so this might be a little bit of a struggle, but we'll make it. The project here is to discuss this new subdiscipline of the philosophy of science called the metaphysics of science. And I want to articulate two different possible ways of thinking about this discipline and its relationship to the sciences. And then I want to, I don't have enough time to really give an argument, but I want to kind of sketch an argument or give some reasons to think that one conception is more central than the other. So what is this thing called metaphysics of science? It's kind of a oxymoron if you think about the origins of the philosophy of science and logical empiricism and logical positivism. Well, I can do an ostensive definition. There's a society now that's doing some of the, that's focused on some of the most exciting areas of professional philosophical research. So that's the kinds of things that those people do. This is also a noteworthy moment because it's sort of the emergence of the subdiscipline into self-consciousness, historical self-consciousness. So it seemed particularly important to think about what it is and what it could be. And also there's an article, not yet in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And I don't think I have strong disagreements with the people who wrote this, but I'm not going to engage with it fully, but this is just to say that that's there. And Gunnar and Schrenk here say that metaphysics of science is the philosophical study of key concepts that figure prominently in science, and that prima facie stand in need of clarification. And some exemplary topics include laws of nature, causation, dispositions, natural kinds, possibility, necessity, explanation, reduction, emergence, grounding, and space-time. So that sounds about right. And this remark is interesting, and I offer this just as food for thought, but I'm not going to go too much into this, that the metaphysics of science is both, it's a subfield both of metaphysics and the philosophy of science. So it can be allocated to either, but exhaust neither. That's an interesting way of putting it. I'm going to do a little history just to sort of think about the trajectory that made this oxymoron of a subdiscipline not an oxymoron. And another uncontroversial philosopher, Rorty here, I'm going to appeal to his notion of Geistesgeschichte to defend or at least ameliorate worries about this kind of potted history. So I'm going to combine the brisk wiggery of rational reconstruction with the ironic empathy of contextualist history. And you know, of the four genres, the Geistesgeschichte is opposed with doxography, which is sort of a staid and stale sort of canon that has no use. So hopefully I don't fall into that, but I'm going to try to do something like this, broad strokes Geistesgeschichte. Here are a couple good books and a good logician that I think tell maybe a sort of standard story about how we turned away from thinking of philosophy of science as primarily focused on determining the logic of science to more general sort of understandings. So Quine's naturalism, Kuhn's historicism, and well, maybe me and Hannes will have to fight about this a bit, but I think also the maybe not the actual, but at least the apparent failure of logicism made it such that you couldn't think that logic would be a foundation for everything. And so then the role of axiomatic systems became much more local and too local to capture all of science. Another trend was the rise of scientific realism, and here's sort of the Minnesota wing of that movement. Grover Maxwell, Wilfrid Sellars and Herbert Feigl. When you start taking seriously scientific realism and you start thinking that these things really exist, then you need to have an account of what it is for those things to be, how those things relate to the ordinary objects that we experience, the relationship between the scientific image and the ordinary image. Then a third trend here is just the more general, sort of outside of philosophy of science, revival of metaphysics. So particularly here, I'm focusing on the sort of revival of modal, or the development of modal tools and modal logic and modal metaphysics. So Ruth Barkin Marcus, Saul Kripke, and David Lewis all sort of developed these tools that then got used by people concerned with scientific realism and concerned with naturalism to kind of think about what these theories are telling us if they're really true. So now I want to just briefly sort of gesture at two ways you might characterize two different conceptions. And then I'm going to give some examples in a particular sub-area of the metaphysics of science. So I'm borrowing this notion of a methodological discipline from Gil Salgi, who developed this in thinking of how to revive a notion of logic as exceptional. So the old view was something like logic is exceptional because it's epistemically prior to other disciplines or somehow foundational. And things like Quine's naturalism made people doubt that. She argues that logic can be thought of as exceptional, but not in this foundationalist way, but that it plays this sort of methodological role relative to other disciplines, and actually all disciplines. And so here's maybe a way of talking about this distinction, both for logic, but I'm moving it to metaphysics. So so the old view is that metaphysics is, or logic is more fundamental than the sciences. The new view is something like metaphysics produces tools, methods, or a methodology for the sciences. And so that quote is from Sagi talking about logic. Now, this is really gestural, but Quine articulated a distinction between the ideology and the ontology of a theory, where the ontology is the things you quantify over, and the ideology are the predicates that you have in that language. I want to sort of liberalize that distinction and say something like, one way you might think of metaphysics as methodological for the sciences is that it helps articulate the fundamental concepts or structures of the relevant science, while instead of trying to reduce its ontology to something else that's more familiar or more foundational or something like that. So it's sort of taking the ideology of the science seriously. So I'm going to focus a bit on the metaphysics of physics, particularly as related to its quantitative structure or mathematical structure. And so I have two examples of both kinds of ways of doing metaphysics of science in relation to the quantitative nature of physics. So first is Hartree Field's Science Without Numbers, where he attempts to reduce much of the mathematical structure of physics to space-time structure. Sort of a follow-up to that project, Z. Perry has been developing sort of a mereological reduction of physical quantities that's more thoroughgoing of a reduction than Hartree Field's reduction. A lot of that is very interesting and good, so I just want to say again that my project here is to say that we shouldn't do this kind of metaphysics of science, but just to articulate a distinction between the two kinds and to say that the methodological way of thinking about the metaphysics of science is worthwhile. So, one key example for me of thinking about articulating the ideology of physics is David Wallace's recent development of a mathematical, or a mathematics first approach to structural realism, where instead of thinking about structural realism in terms of sort of the syntactic way of thinking about theories, where it's a set of deductively closed sentences, and then you can ramify out and then ask what things, what the structures are that sort of describe those entities that you're quantifying over. You just think about the mathematical structure and have that be your guide to thinking about what the theory says. And I have a collection of papers working on dimensional analysis and seeing how that tells us about the metaphysical structure of physics and its role in measurement and its role in debates about symmetries. And this, I can't really go into this too much, but this aspect of physics is a different way of thinking about the quantitative structure of physics than David Wallace's mathematical structural realism, in that I'm taking seriously that these are quantities and not numbers. And so dimensional analysis focuses on the fact that things like force, mass, length, time, and so on have these interrelations as properties or whatever you think they are. And these relations are important and are not captured by mere mathematical structure. My final kind of not Geistgeschichte sort of argument for thinking about the methodological conception of metaphysics as maybe more central to the metaphysics of science is that it's maybe more descriptively adequate and future-facing in that way. Particularly that it allows for a metaphysics of the special sciences. And it's important to note here that this includes effective or non-fundamental physics. It's not just biology, it's just within physics. Carrie McKenzie and people have worried about the prospects of a naturalistic metaphysics when we don't have a final physics. And so this conception kind of sidesteps some of those worries. This also justifies internal and partial reductionist programs that ask, well, what's the minimal set of what's the minimal ideology we need to understand this bit of physics? It's not a problem then if it's not complete, like a full reductionist project would want. It also keeps open the possibility of alien languages and alternative logics that might be relevant, and maybe alien languages that come from machine learning with different kinds of properties or something like that. And maybe some of the projects people here are thinking about. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you. That was great. Wondering about that last point. How does it eliminate alien languages? Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I don't want to say that it eliminates them, that it allows that to be done. And I guess what I'm thinking about is work that people like Shamik Dasgupta and there's this other guy who has a book on this, and I forgot his name and I forgot to look it up, have been thinking about, particularly for structural realism, logics that don't have individuals in them. One problem with the sort of slogan of this ontic structural realists is they say, relations without relata, or the relations are more fundamental than the relata, and we've never seen a language like that. And so you might worry that that's sort of against our fundamental conceptual schemes. But if you think, well, maybe somewhere in the mathematics or the quantitative structure of physics, there just are things that are like relations without relata, then you don't need to really worry so much about whether or not you can translate it into first order logic or second order logic or some kind of language derived from that kind of more naturalistic ideology.
Reminds me of Whitehead's emphasis on relations without relata, kind of brings that into relevance possible. It changes the whole logical picture there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting, and I have lots of questions for you, but I was kind of hoping to go back to the part about like the Society for Metaphysics of Science and how this kind of straddles these two different fields. Because in conversations with some of these people and reading the things, there really seems to be two different kinds of approaches, and it seems like it's awkward and still hasn't figured out how to straddle these. Because I found that there's a lot of people in one stream that have certain intuitions, and people in the other that have just entirely opposite intuitions about what would be a good direction to go, or about how little you need or want to aim for, and things like this, in terms of like reduction of your ontology or reduction of your ideology. And so I was just wondering what you thought about like the current state of things there, because it still feels like it's two different streams of discussion not coming together. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I'm not sure how you would think about these two strands. I do think maybe this will help. The distinction I'm making between a methodological and a foundationalist, foundational or foundationalist conception of the metaphysics of science, I think is a additional distinction between to the distinction between naturalistic and analytic or a priori metaphysics. And so you could have either of those kinds of conceptions on that. And so sort of that, those four or two pairs, I think, of intersecting ways of thinking about the metaphysics of science might explain some of that issue. Yeah, but I guess, and I think that might be the way to think about it, especially because at least a little bit of what I'm getting from what you said is that maybe this difference is in terms of justifying your moves in the metaphysics of science, which to me seems like at least one sort of broad strokes way of thinking about it is naturalism versus analytic approaches.
Hi, Mahmoud. That was a really interesting talk. One of the things that I found particularly interesting was that you called metaphysics of science like a new discipline. And I found that interesting because, this isn't something we hear in HPS a lot, but outside of HPS departments, you see metaphysics of science all the time with, like, say, David Armstrong, just to take a particular paradigm. And I suspect that there are a lot of people in the room, or a lot of HPSers who see that at least old version of metaphysics of science as maybe not a mistake, but like not exactly in line with the kind of philosophy of science that we or they would want to do. And so I was wondering, is the sort of methodological picture, are you going to say that's more amenable than the kind of Armstrong program? Or do you think that the problems that people might have with the Armstrong program are problems with like bad metaphysics of science as opposed to like good modern metaphysics of science?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a tough question in a way. So there's one thing I want to say generally, which is that I think someone like Fons could maybe actually make this case more seriously. But I guess one thing I mean to say when I say it's a new discipline is not to say that people haven't done work that's like this, but that it's now kind of a discipline in that people are sort of disciplined to be within certain bounds, and there's at least some vague sense of a coherent shared project or something like that. Although Holly's worry still stands, so it's not fully formed yet or something like that. But I think we're seeing something like the disciplinary formation starting to happen. I wonder what Armstrong's own self-conception was. I think that kind of project would fall more under the foundational approach, particularly just because it's, I think one aspect of it is trying to do things in these logical systems that were not developed for the science, or not sort of native to the scientific language or something like that. And even if that's not exactly reduction, but it's sort of a translation or a restatement or a rational reconstruction or something like that, I think the aims of that kind of project are more foundational. But again, I don't want to say that the foundationalist projects are bad. I think they're useful and helpful. but they're not the only game in town. And I think there's a certain sense in which they're not to be seen as central.
Let's thank Mahmoud.